Coming up on this week's podcast, did Oscar Piastri deserve his huge penalty? Is it now a two-way title fight? Where does Silverstone leave Max Verstappen? And just how good is Nico Hulkenberg? It's time for the latest episode of the Racing News 365 podcast. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Racing News 365 podcast, looking back at last weekend's British Grand Prix and the first half of the season in general. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm delighted to be joined, as always, by the awesome duo. That is 2023 Young Journalist of the Year, Sam, absolutely peace. Coop, we got there eventually for those watching on YouTube, and the man, the myth, the almighty legend, who is once again not at home, almighty, who is once again not at home, and he'll explain why in a second. It is lead editor Ian Parks. Right, sensible, right, guys, sensible. Come on, got lots to get through. We're being professional today. Ian, speaking of being professional, you are once again not at home, which you're becoming renowned for on this podcast. Where on earth are you this time?
I'm delighted to say I'm actually in a meeting room in the offices of Motorsport UK in Bicester, because just to tease something that we've got coming up next Monday on our podcast, I had the privilege of, you and I, Nick, had the privilege of sitting down and doing our podcast with another renowned motorsport personality. I won't give the game away. Tune in next week, folks, next Monday to review that one. But yes, back-to-back podcasts for Nick and myself. We did that first one, and now which is going out next Monday. And of course, it's us three, yay, doing this one for this week, post-British Grand Prix, and a lot to get through.
I will give a little clue, a little hint to our viewers so they have a bit of a week to think about it. All I will say is that the timing of the podcast was absolutely perfect. That's all I'm going to say. Couldn't have been better. Anyways, we have got a lot to discuss because we had rain, we had sunshine, we had then further heavy rain before yet more sunshine. The race had everything: chaos, crashes, penalties, a home win for Lando Norris, a first podium for Nico Hulkenberg, but in particular, there were quite a lot of pit stops. So my question to the both of you, how many pit stops were completed during the British Grand Prix? But a point I will make, this is completed pit stops, not pit stops where a driver has entered the garage to retire from the race. So they had to have entered, then left the pit lane.
Yep.
Well, hold on. Now you're not including those that came in at the end of the formation lap, are you? Because that does not count as a pit stop.
Correct.
Because it was at the end of the formation lap. It's not during the Grand Prix.
Correct.
So you're not including those, because that was 5 drivers that did that.
It was. So it doesn't include the 5 pit stops that happened before the lights actually went out, as you do. And it also doesn't include drivers like Kimi Antonelli, for example, who brought his car into the pits to then retire. So it had to be completed pit stops where they have entered the pit lane and then exited it during the race itself. Sam looks puzzled. But I'm going to make you.
Well, no, I'm doing the plus minus. Obviously, some of the guys retired after no stops. Some retired after one. It's all kind of So I'm doing my beautiful mind type.
Okay, Ian's gone straight in on 29. Sam, are you going to go higher? Are you going to go lower? What are you thinking? Absolutely.
38.
38. I mean, that's way too high. I mean, Ian, you win quite clearly because it was 28. So you're actually only one above. So a very good 28, which actually was lower than I was expecting given everything that happened. However, a lot of that was because, as Ian pointed out, 5 drivers pitted before the race had, actually started. So yes, you look puzzled. Like I said, Sam, why is that?
Well, no, because obviously 20 drivers, 2 pit stops, take off a few, gets you down to 30. Then I was like, a few will have done 3. So, okay, 38 was too high, but I was thinking it would be like mid-30s.
Whereas Lance Stroll did a 3-stop strategy remarkably.
Well, exactly, anyways, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, some 3 stops.
But the top 3 all did a 1-stop strategy. So Pirelli's prediction came true despite the conditions. But anyways, a nice little question to get us going. Let's move on and discuss our biggest takeaways from Silverstone. Sam, you can go first, my friend.
So my biggest takeaway from the weekend, aside from obviously Nico Hulkenberg, and we'll get onto that, I'm sure, is that whilst Oscar Piastri might not be flappable, you can get under his skin. And it was the stewards that got under his skin this weekend, but that will have sent out a big old signal to Lando Norris going, okay, so when it gets to it, I can push certain buttons and provoke Oscar and potentially elicit a response from him that might be favourable towards me. If he's kind of looking at it strategically as to how this fight might end up going, because whilst it's all kind of, sunshine and rainbows between the two of them at the moment, it's very difficult to predict that that's going to continue to be the case when it gets down to the wire. So it was nice to see a human side of Oscar, not in that he's not human, but you just couldn't have predicted that he would have got out of the car and been like, no, Jensen, don't talk to me.
The more emotional side, I think you're referring to that. Sam.
Yes. Yeah, more emotional. That's a better phrase than human. And yeah, for him to basically be like, no, I'm not going to speak because I'm going to get myself in trouble, is a real departure from the Oscar we've seen in the past, even when things have gone against him and he's made mistakes and so on and so forth. So I think that's quite an intriguing element of the weekend, which will have a long tail to it across the rest of the season.
See, that's interesting because mine is also to do with Oscar, but it's more the fact of, obviously, in my eyes, Canada and what happened there was quite clearly a turning point for Lando, who's gone on to win back-to-back races. Since then, okay, yes, at 2 circuits, we know he's very, very strong. For me, I feel like this is going to be a turning point for Oscar, and that it was really good to see him with that emotion, because it does show to you just how much this means to him, and that he knows he recognises he can win a title this year. And I have every belief that this is going to be the moment where we see him now really roll up his sleeves, visor down, and just, potentially maybe become dominant. Who knows? But for me, this is a big turning point for Oscar, where we could see him now just really knuckle down and just get on with this title. Ian, for you, what was your biggest takeaway?
So I'm going to go for something different. I know we're going to come on to the Oscar Lando Max situation a little bit more extensively in a few moments. But for me, naturally, I think it has to be Nico, and the fact that you can never say never. He's had this quite remarkable career, motorsport career in many respects, and of course, this longevity in Formula One. And a guy that's never been on the podium, yet that was his 239th Grand Prix, which I think underlines just what Nico Hulkenberg's career has been all about, that you can always rely on him no matter what. Great experience, great stability behind the wheel, patience, but also a great racing brain, good knowledge, good speed overall. It's always been that case with Nico, hasn't it? He's never quite been in the right car at the right time. And here, this was one of those stars aligning days where finally everything just fell into place for him. So yeah, for me, as I say, a case of just never give up. Always believe in yourself, even if everybody else around you doubts.
Right, let's look back at our predictions from Silverstone. In all honesty, the reason I'm doing this now and not at the end, because, well, it wasn't our best efforts, it has to be said, after some really big scores from yourself, Ian. Anyways, so of us three and Leo from Australia, who represented the fans, Sam, it was you who got the lowest score in Silverstone. You picked up an almighty 2 points. You said Oscar Piastri would win. He finished second, therefore you got a point, as that was one position above or below where you predicted. You also said Hamilton would finish in third. So for the same rules, you got a point as he finished in fourth, giving you 2. I wasn't much better. I came in third on 3 points for literally only predicting that Oscar would finish second. That was it. Leo, for the fans, was in second with 4 points for predicting that Lando would win and that Oscar would finish third. Again, because he finished in second, that was obviously one place above or below the prediction. And that means that Ian scored 7 points and was the person with the most points again for a Grand Prix in Silverstone, because Ian, you predicted the top 2 correctly in that Lando would win, Oscar second, and you also said that Lewis would finish in third. Of course, he finished fourth, so again, for the same rules, that's 7 points for you. There was 1 point though I was getting very concerned, because during a race, I always keep track of our predictions. You were on track at one point for 15 points. And I was starting to think, oh no, what do we do here? Interestingly, none of us got the fastest pit stop points because Red Bull got the fastest pit stop, which is very, very interesting. What it does mean, though, is that in the leaderboard, which I don't really want to read out, in joint third, I won't say last, in joint third, on 58 points is Sam and the fans. I'm only just ahead in second on 60 points, but in the lead by a country mile is Ian on 82 points going into the second half of the season. A pretty spectacular performance, it's got to be said. Moving on though, and yes, we've got to discuss Oscar Piastri, because obviously it's a penalty which has been one of the biggest talking points from the Grand Prix. We're running a poll currently on Racing News 365 asking our viewers what they thought. Was it too harsh? Was it not harsh enough? And it does seem that the vast majority of viewers believe it should have been a 5-second time penalty instead. The thing is though, Ian, regardless of whether the penalty was accurate for, obviously, as deemed by the stewards, erratic driving or not, it's a precedent now, isn't it, that's been set going forwards?
Yeah, it's erratic braking. You say a precedent, yes, quite obviously, but you have to appreciate the circumstances as well under which that erratic braking took place. A lot was raised post Grand Prix with regard to the fact that just a few weeks previously in Canada, we had another braking episode behind the safety car. And obviously, if you remember, that was George Russell and Max Verstappen. George appearing to brake test to a certain or lesser extent Max Verstappen. Max, of course, just managing to get his nose in front. And of course, we had all that consternation about whether George had done it deliberately to get Max ahead and overtaking under the safety car, potential penalty for Max there, getting that 1 point that he needed to get that race ban. And then, of course, we had this braking behind the safety car. The difference, of course, between this incident at Silverstone and the incident in Montreal was, of course, completely dry conditions in Montreal. And, of course, when Oscar's incident behind the safety car took place with Max at Silverstone, it was a really, really wet track, to such an extent that you only have to look at Max's onboard and the volume of spray being kicked up by the McLaren ahead of him at just over 200 kilometers an hour to appreciate the circumstances. And bearing in mind as well, we had Isaac Hadjar going into the back of Kimi Antonelli in those really atrocious wet conditions at that particular time, to understand just why the stewards on this occasion took quite a lenient, quite a strong point of view. Oscar braked from 218 kilometers an hour to 52 kilometers an hour. And of course, in the blink of an eye, with Max behind him, all that spray pluming off the car. Yes, Max quite comfortably managed to avoid Oscar in the end, but nevertheless, given the conditions, the circumstances, everything else, given, as I say, the Isaac Kimi incident as well, they deemed it necessary to hit Oscar hard. Was it harsh? I think probably with a lot of fans, I think 5 seconds would have been enough. I thought 10 seconds was quite excessive. And there's another area as well that I know we're going to get onto in a minute, because I'll let you two guys have your say. But overall, I felt the penalty, as a penalty, was just. I do feel that 10 seconds was a little excessive in this case by the stewards, and 5 would have been enough.
Yeah, I'd say for me, 5 seconds would have been fair. The penalty points as well, but this is where I guess as viewers of the sport, you start to make comparisons, and obviously one which was mentioned by Sky F1's post-race coverage is that the 10-second time penalty that Oscar received for the incident, obviously at the second safety car restart, was the same size of time penalty that Max Verstappen got in Spain with the George Russell incident. So I guess that's the one thing where it's almost dangerous in a way to actually compare penalties. But Sam, I'll come to you because interestingly, I'll obviously give your thoughts on this, on the penalty as well. But Jenson Button actually praised Oscar Piastri after the race for just being so clever, and the fact that obviously McLaren obviously said to Piastri that they believed obviously it was a very harsh penalty, which was exactly as well what was being said by Zach Brown, Andrea Stella after the race. Oscar obviously came onto the radio to McLaren after serving the penalty to say, come on guys, you think this is harsh, let's swap the positions back and let us race. Jenson Button thought that was absolutely brilliant because it shows of what Oscar was thinking about and almost not using McLaren's words against them, but actually having that mental capacity still whilst racing in those conditions to try and make such a request.
It was a bit of a put your money where your mouth is moment from Oscar. And you've got to kind of respect that he's got the capacity to think like that behind the wheel with all those circumstances going on. Going, well, you guys have said it's unfair. Show me you think it's unfair. Revert the positions and put us as you feel we should have been with no penalty. So you've got to respect it. Obviously, McLaren were never going to go for that because why would you? I mean, first of all, good luck getting Lando to agree and give the position up. But secondly, why would you cause that animosity and that that tension in the team unnecessarily? Like they'd served the penalty. They'd gone, look, we've decided not to fight it, or we've had conversations and this isn't going to go in our direction. So, yeah, but credit to Oscar for trying. I think I agree that it definitely was a penalty. The stewards had kind of banged to rights on that it was a penalty. What you could argue in terms of mitigating it down to a 5-second penalty, because 10 is the normal penalty you would give for the incident, is that the safety car light went out very late to say that it was going to be a restart of the race. And as that happened, Oscar was accelerating. And so in that moment, he thinks, well, once I've accelerated, I've kind of restarted this race and I need to let the safety car be cleared. And so he instantly reacted and said, right, I need to call off here. But it was a very, very heavy brake, or double the braking episode that George had in Canada. So yeah, there was mitigating circumstances that you could have softened the penalty with if you were a steward. So I understand why he's aggrieved. I also find it somewhat interesting or amusing that McLaren certainly felt Red Bull made the most out of the incident, or that Max did, and that he didn't necessarily need to put his car in front of Oscar's. He could have just kind of gone alongside, and it was almost a little bit of gamesmanship there, which I think is a fair point. But then after the race, for Max to turn around and go, well, I thought it was quite extreme, the penalty. I thought it was a bit much. To go, well, you kind of highlighted it to the stewards. Whether they would have seen it in the data anyway, the race director would have gone, actually, well, that was a bit much. I'm going to send a report, even if Max hadn't done that. But he certainly made it very obvious that had happened to everyone watching. So, yeah, another intriguing kind of side element to the entire episode.
But there is
I was going to say, I think the biggest point to this, and it was the point I was going to make, but obviously I'll let you guys have your say as well. For me, it was another incident, and I'm going to draw on Andrea Stella here, that really should have been looked at post-race. And I know it's real 6 of one and half a dozen the other, and it's one of those dividing lines that we all want to see incidents sorted out whilst the race is taking place. And in this case, there was a long time from when that incident took place before the end of the race. But also there are certain incidents as well where you feel, well, actually, it appears there might just be mitigating circumstances here, and maybe it should be looked at post-race. And I think this was definitely one of those that should have been looked at post-race, because it was behind the safety car. Oscar made the point, well, hold on, the safety car light went out just as I was accelerating, as Sam also mentioned as well. So therefore, he had to very quickly back off, and that's probably why he hit the brakes perhaps a lot harder than he should have done, and why the speed reduction element was a lot severe than it might ordinarily have been. But nevertheless, when you've got Max as well turning around and saying, I feel that was extreme, he would, and whilst, yes, he did play a central part in the 10-second penalty being 10 seconds, what would he have said in the steward's room afterwards? Would he have been as defensive of Oscar? Would he have said, well, actually, I actually had it quite under control? Potentially would he have said, I just made it look that little bit worse than it looked on screen at the time. Who knows? But nevertheless, from McLaren's perspective, Andrea Stella rightly pointing out that there were circumstances around this one that really needed further discussion rather than it being sorted there and then. I know for us as media, for fans, it's great that something's sorted out immediately. We get an immediate decision taken, and we're allowed for the racing to continue without thinking, oh, is it going to affect the results post-race when we've got this investigation come up? How long are we going to have to wait to get an actual result? There is that element to be taken into consideration as well. But overall, I do feel there were mitigating circumstances with regard to this, and it should have been looked at afterwards.
Funnily enough, this was actually going to be my next question to the pair of you is, whether it should have been one investigated after the race rather than during. But it's also a question I'd like to put to our fans watching on YouTube. What is it you would like from the stewards? Are you glad to see decisions pretty much now on the whole always being decided during the race? Or would you rather see, for example, an incident like Oscar's, like Max and George's in Spain, another one coming into mind, to be investigated after the race instead, even if it does mean you've got to wait a couple of hours for the final result? Because for me, that's the difficult one, isn't it? And this, I don't really necessarily have an opinion on it, in all honesty, because I don't actually know. Yes, of course, it's good to see that the driver who crosses the finish line first is the race winner, but at the same time, if there's a decision which perhaps was made quicker than maybe you think is fair, then it should have been left after the race. It's very difficult to find that balance, and that's one job of the stewards I would absolutely not want. Sam, do you have a quick thought on that topic?
I agree with both your points on that. It would have allowed some clarity. It would have allowed the race to have continued uninterrupted, and you probably would have got a more representative result, because let's face it, Oscar was the stronger driver on the day, and the record book will show that he lost by 6.8 seconds after that 10-second penalty. But it would have been far closer had he not backed off quite considerably on the last lap. So a 5-second penalty, probably, if they had enacted that during the race, Oscar still probably would have won. So, there's one point in that. And then a second point in that after the race, whilst you don't make decisions based on what the outcome will be, you have a clearer picture of what the ramifications are. So, it would have been a more appropriate route to go down in this point. So, that's a very well-raised point by Ian.
And just to conclude very, very swiftly, Nick, it's a case of the stewards are in a no-win situation. Yes. They're damned if they do make decisions in race. They're damned if they don't make decisions in race, and they take it to a post-race investigation. Really, really hard job.
Yeah. Just finally on McLaren, obviously looking at more of the first half of the season in general, obviously Piastri leads the title by 8 points over Lando Norris. Max Verstappen is now 69 points adrift. Very quickly to the pair of you, looking ahead to the second half of the season, is this now a two-way fight for the title? Is this Oscar v Lando for what will be for either of them a maiden driver's crown? Sam, your thoughts first.
I'm going to maintain my stance of never count Max out until he's mathematically out of it. But those chances are getting increasingly minimal, to the extent it's next to no chance that he is going to be in this fight for the long term. So it very much is, for all intents and purposes, a 2-horse race between the two of them.
Ian?
Well, there's 324 points available. So it's a long shot now for Max. It really is. He's had a run of 4 races where he's only scored 28, 29 points. I think the point's been well made that he's actually now scored less points in those 4 races than Nico Hulkenberg. So it gives you some idea that the fact that over those past 4 races, his title hopes have faded, but it's always a case of, and I'm going to use the phrase again, as I refer to Nico Hulkenberg, never say never. You cannot rule Max out of this until mathematically the points say otherwise.
Let's move on to Max, because actually it was a staggering display ultimately by him in Silverstone for a number of reasons. First things first, yet again, the difficulties Red Bull had on the Friday at Silverstone, the overnight changes, effectively running a Monza spec rear wing, very low downforce, a sensational pole position lap, it's got to be said, at the death in qualifying, and then the way he managed to hold on to that RB21 in the rain on Sunday in conditions where drivers with, let's say, the right downforce setup was still struggling as well. Max obviously had that moment where he obviously kind of spun, but didn't at the same time, just about held it, recovered to fifth. The question is, though, for the pair of you, and Ian, you can go first on this one. He is now 69 points adrift, has actually ruled himself out again of the title fight in the most relaxed way I've heard him after Silverstone, just very much saying, yeah, this year is just not the one. It's quite clear he doesn't have a comfortable car to drive. The fact Red Bull were having to make so many extreme changes overnight from Friday into Saturday, almost every Grand Prix. But also at the same time now, he's actually 18 points ahead of George Russell in that fight for third. And we've discussed this point that obviously we understand at Racing News 365 that if Max is outside the top three at some point during the summer, we're not too sure on the exact date, they could then activate a contract clause. Well, it's actually looking increasingly likely that he's probably going to stay in third in the standings. Of course, other clauses to take into account as well, but that one in particular looks like it's unlikely that he'll be able to activate it. What is next for Max, Ian? Because it looks like it's going to be a pretty hard second half of the season.
It's building up towards next year. It's doing everything he can to assist the team in whatever way he can for the development of that 26 car. We've heard a lot of noise coming out of the drivers who have had the opportunity to test the 26 car in the simulator, and none of them are happy. I mean, just to draw on Lance Stroll for a second, Lance Stroll was probably the most animated I've ever seen Lance Stroll in a Thursday drivers press session at Silverstone last week, when I asked him about the opportunity of a 26 car in the simulator, whether he'd done that yet. And he was very, very critical, not happy at all with the way that car was shaping up. Now, what I'm going to say to that is to go back to 2013 into 2014, go back to 2021 into 2022, and also not only through the entire 22 season, but onto 2023, when we've had major regulation changes. The drivers have always complained about the cars going from 13 into 14 when we had the new power units. A lot of noise was made then about the clipping of the cars that was taking place and what the drivers were having to do to mitigate that. We don't talk about that anymore. That was a bygone thing that was quite swiftly eradicated. Obviously, look at what happened with all the porpoising. Yeah, for a number of teams, as I say, it continued. It was awful in 22. Or complaining about bad backs. Their careers could be shortened by the injuries that they potentially could sustain to their spines. And yes, certain teams carried that into 2023. But again, it was another one of those times that was one of those situations that was quickly sorted. And now we don't talk about porpoising in the cars anymore. We don't talk about what the 2014 power unit like at the start of that particular season. I'm sure it's going to be exactly the same when we get into 2026. There's going to be a lot of driver complaints about 26 and what the power unit's like and about the energy saving, etc. But again, just to draw back to your original question, I have no doubt that Max is doing everything he possibly can right now to ensure that the car he gets for 2026 is going to be a drivable one and as good as it can possibly be under the circumstances going forward. This is I'm sure this is going to be Max's focus right now over this period of time. Should it be more than likely, and I'm sure it is going to be more than likely going to be the case, that he will be at Red Bull in 26.
Sam, for you?
Yeah, I very much echo Ian's stance of that it's all eyes forward for Max if he really just does genuinely feel he is out of this championship fight. And he'll still be focusing on race wins. He'll still be focusing on what he can do to have successes throughout the year. But your attention, your direction changes slightly if you feel you're outside of the championship battle, which he does, and you can understand why he is saying that and has done for the last couple of rounds. But Max is a fierce competitor. It's not going to. There's never going to be a case of I'm just going to ease off a little bit and I'll rack up a few kind of high point scoring finishes and podiums. He's going to want to go for wins. That's just his. You don't get to the pinnacle of motorsport without being so kind of singularly driven on that one focus that you've had since you were a child. So yeah, he will very much continue in that vein. And also the noise around Mercedes and whether or not he's going there, if it's 26, if it's 27, if it's at all. he is a consummate professional. He will not be, that will have no bearing on the effort and the attention that he is paying Red Bull in advancing their car for next year. He is all in on this project, as any of those drivers up and down the grid would be, until they're not. So that, I think that's the max that you're going to see throughout the rest of the year. And anything else that comes with it is just a bonus, probably.
Right, we've still got 4 talking points to get through. So let's get a bit of a move on. Let's discuss Ferrari. Obviously, Ian, we didn't get a massive chance to talk about them in Sunday's F1 update, which if you haven't watched yet, please go and do so. It was a very, very good one. And both Lewis and Charles, again, very critical of Ferrari, demanding answers going into the second half of the season. Lewis pointed out it was a big opportunity missed. I mean, absolutely. The fact that Nico Hulkenberg got on the podium showed that so many of the big teams faltered under the tough conditions. But Jenson Button, obviously 2009 world champion, was absolutely brutal in Sky's post-race coverage, pointing out that when it's mixed weather, do the opposite strategy-wise to Charles Leclerc, because he seems to always not get it right in these conditions. But it wasn't it? It was a huge chance for Ferrari at Silverstone. Yes, qualifying 5th and 6th wasn't as good as they were hoping for, but nevertheless, everyone was looking to Ferrari in the race to come through, given Lewis's skills, proven skills in the wet. But in the end, even he pointed out just how difficult that car was to drive in those conditions.
I think he turned around and said that's the worst car he's ever driven around Silverstone.
Yeah.
Which gives you some idea. Because when we saw towards the end of the race, I think anybody was looking at that with, at the point, obviously the McLarens are out in the distance. You got Lance Stroll 3rd, Nico Hulkenberg 4th, and Lewis Hamilton 5th. And for all the money in the world, you would have put that on Lewis Hamilton going on to comfortably get past those 2 guys ahead and go on to finish 3rd. Because at the end of the day, it's a stake in an Aston Martin that were ahead of him. So we saw in short order on one lap in particular that both Nico and Lewis passed Lance Stroll. And Lewis then started to close in on Nico, and I think he managed to get the gap between them down to 1 second exactly. But then it just never happened. Very slowly, his inter started to fade. He made the pit stop back onto slicks when the opportunity arose. But again, you thought, Lewis on slicks, in the dry, is going to get up to the back of that stake and get Nico Hulkenberg for 3rd. Deny Nico Hulkenberg, again, that podium position that he's long craved. And it didn't happen. It was really, really strange to see that. So fundamentally, there is something not quite right with that Ferrari. And on Charles Leclerc's side of the garage, as you say, I can't do any better than Jenson Button's comment, because how many times have we seen strategic mistakes inside Ferrari that have cost Charles in particular numerous points over past seasons? Too many to mention.
But actually, and I'll come to you on another team, Sam, because Ferrari for me wasn't the only surprise on Sunday. I was really surprised in general by Mercedes across the British Grand Prix. George Russell really delivered one of his laps of the season in qualifying to secure 4th on the grid, when actually people were wondering where on earth Mercedes would get to. And it was really bizarre because we look at recent years and Mercedes has always been consistently quick for both George and obviously for Lewis as well around Silverstone. Whereas with the exception of George's final Q3 lap, they were nowhere in the dry and in the wet, despite what were across the weekend itself. You'd imagine perfect conditions for them, given how cool it was. Was that the biggest surprise of the weekend for you?
It was certainly one of them. George going into the week or over the weekend was saying actually he didn't want rain because it would actually not work in the favour of the W16 in many ways, and that a cool, drier climate would be ideal. You got half that, you didn't get the other. And that was then compounded by some curious strategic decisions by the team. So, first of all, bringing in slicks, hards, no one, the most difficult tyre to get up to temperature in difficult conditions, had a big spin, had big moments. He was then at odds with the team a little bit throughout the race. He was kind of pushing to be very kind of aggressive and bold. And, there was that quote from Marcus Dudley basically say, we want to be aggressive, but not suicidal. Like which was very punchy to say to your driver over radio during a race. But you can understand that they are trying to kind of keep it in bounds, having already made a previous error. So yeah, they were just a little bit kind of adrift and at sea from where they usually would be. And we do see this from time to time with not only Mercedes, but all teams. They will make strategic errors. It's just how often or consistently some do, like Ferrari, as Jensen Button kind of alluded to, is that quite often when it gets tricky and it's very changeable and marginal, they're often on the wrong side of that margin. And I think Mercedes, a lot of it, was a not particularly strong race car was then compounded by strategic misjudgments. And also Kimi Antonelli's race was, ruined by his unfortunate, being hit from behind by Isaac Hadjar. So it was one of those weekends to forget. I think they'll be able to brush it off and move on pretty quickly. But the question marks that they've had for the last few rounds and the last couple of years over how to get their car to work in warmer climates does very much still loom large.
It was a weekend to forget for Mercedes, a weekend to never forget for Stake and for Nico Hulkenberg. So let's discuss the Hulk, because obviously it's staggering when we think of his career. The fact that, he went for a couple of seasons not on the grid, sitting in a reserve role, and you were wondering, is that his career done? Of course, he's come back into the sport over the last couple of years, done a spectacular job, despite being one of the oldest drivers on the grid as well. On his 239th F1 start, finally claiming a podium. It felt like something out of the F1 movie a little bit. But Ian, it's got to be said, is Nico one of the most underrated drivers, not just on the current grid, but actually in F1's modern history, given what he's achieved and gone under the radar doing so?
Oh, good question, mate. Underrated, yes, I think. But in F1's modern history, it's probably pushing it, but certainly underrated in the current era. Simply because, as I said at the very beginning, when I talked about Nico a little bit, I do think in Nico's career, it's often been a case of being in the wrong car at the wrong time, or being in the wrong car at the right time, perhaps, or being in the right time but the wrong car. The mix of everything, and he's had his opportunities, but they've just never quite been there for him. But I extol the virtues to quite an extent of everything that I believe Nico Hulkenberg as a driver to be. And he has got pace, he's got speed, he's got talent, he's got temperament, he's got patience. And overall, he's just got a general natural ability to drive a car well. If given the right car at the right time, would he be a title challenger? That's a huge hypothetical. I don't know. Certainly you would expect him to be there or thereabouts. I think it's going to be a fascinating period when he goes, or not when he goes, but when Sauber becomes Audi next season, and how quickly Audi can get that operation up to speed. Is that team going to be quickly thrust into the mix? Because as we've often talked about 26, we do not know which team is going to have the edge in 26. Could Audi be, hit the ground running straight away with its power unit? We know, quite obviously, there is a fantastic organisation in place with the Sauber organisation in Himwell, on top of which Audi is now building with its power unit as the complete package. Will it give Nico Hulkenberg that car in which he could potentially deliver on a more consistent, regular basis? Potentially, as I say. I'm looking forward to seeing what Nico Hulkenberg and Audi, as well as Gabriel Bortoleto within that team as well, can do in 2026. Certainly, this is a monkey off the back for Nico in many respects, I believe. Finally, he can say now he's got that podium on his belt. His first podium for 10 years and 3 weeks since he won Le Mans in 2015. So, well done, Nico Hulkenberg. Well done, Sauber/Stake. Well deserved overall at the end of the day.
Well, interestingly, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he is the first racing driver to get an F1 podium their first F1 podium after being an outright Le Mans winner.
I'm sure you're probably right.
I have no idea. Sounds good.
is a remarkable stat. So from my perspective, very quickly, I think he's massively matured as a driver over his career, and you can see that in his racecraft, in his time management, everything he does, in the cockpit, but also what he brings to a team outside. He makes teams better. You saw that with Haas. I'm sure he's having a very heavy, a heavy guiding hand with Stake and setting them up for their transition, as Ian's kind of highlighted, to Audi. He is one of those guys that you can build around for the future, whether or not he's going to be the one who ultimately is there to reap the rewards. So I think he's it's really a well-earned podium, and it's nice for him to finally achieve that. But also, interestingly, another fun fact, there's a current driver on the grid who, by the end of next year, if they're still on the grid, will have overtaken Adrian Sittel as the driver with the most race starts without a podium.
Oh, that's a fun question. Okay. I've got to have a second to think about this. Oh, I like that. Ian, any ideas?
Just trying to...
I have an idea.
Just trying to go through.
Yuki? Am I right? It's Yuki Tsunoda.
It's Yuki. Is it like I think it's 101 race starts, or kind of around that?
It's been around a while, and longer than people realise.
Yeah. I mean, the seasons are long these days. It's remarkable, isn't it?
That's a very, very cool stat, and I for one, I'm really fascinated to see that transition into Audi next year, and just how Hulkenberg's experience really builds that team. Something else, moving on to the final talking point that I'm intrigued to see is who will be in the second Alpine come the Belgian Grand Prix. We've got to discuss Franco Colapinto, because I mean, it just goes from bad to worse. Had a little bit of a high a few weeks ago, but then now back down low, obviously, with Silverstone causing a red flag in Q1. Obviously started actually from the pit lane due to a complete engine change, and of course then didn't actually start the Grand Prix. Ian, we discussed this on, I can't remember what day it was, I think it was Sunday, in the F1 update, that Flavio Briatore, no, it was Saturday, Flavio Briatore literally had his head in his hands, which is something, as you pointed out, from somebody you spoke to in the paddock, you very rarely see Flavio showing that side of emotion on camera as well. What do they do? Because we've heard obviously some names rumoured about who could potentially take that second seat for the rest of the season, but the big question has got to be, does Jack Doohan now get a second chance?
I would put him back in the car. I thought it was unfair to have jettisoned Jack in the first place, because you could see there was progress being made. Rookie season, he'd only had 6 Grand Prix with the team. He had one at the end of last year, of course, but that was just a little bit of initiation kind of ceremony almost. But so that 6-race cameo at the start, he made a couple of mistakes. There was one big one in Japan, quite obviously. But I could see progress. I thought there was development there. And I thought, I understand why Flavio did it, because he'd obviously put a lot of faith, a lot of store in bringing Franco Colapinto across. Made a big play, got him on loan from Williams, spoke highly of him when he initially arrived. And you thought, given the way he was talking about him, that it was only going to be a matter of when, not if, he was going to put him in the car. As I say, I thought it was way too early to have got rid of Jack, but Flavio is Flavio, uncompromising in his decision-making. And now when you saw that head-in-hands moment post-qualifying or during qualifying on Saturday after another mistake from Franco, you can only imagine what was running through his mind and thinking, wow, I've got a big decision to make here. Now, Alpine turned around and said that there was a driveline failure or driveline issue that led to Franco's very early retirement. I've heard rumours in the paddock that actually he burned the clutch, and he did so for the second time this season. And if that's the case, if that is to be believed, then that is a huge fundamental error for any driver to make. But to do it once, to do it twice, I think we are most definitely going to see a different driver in that. I'd be amazed if Franco Colapinto was in that car in Belgium. I really would.
Because the big problem, and very, very quickly, Sam, before we bring this to an end, is that actually if they do put Jack back in that second seat, Jack's now been out the car for a few months. He's going to need another period of adjustment to get back up to speed, aren't they?
Yeah.
It would need to be different this time. He would need to have the full support of the team internally. Obviously, externally, they will give the message that they always, you would always expect a team to give. But he needs to feel very secure in that seat to at least the end of the year. He cannot feel like, well, if this doesn't work over the next 5-6 races, they're going to bring say Paul Aaron in for the final few. He needs to be given that time to develop, and I fully agree with Ian that he was showing signs of improvement that you're not seeing from Franco, and it's very difficult for Franco. And I think the one reason why they might keep Franco in the car, I think would be the wrong one, and I think it's a slim one, is the commercial element. Yeah, exactly. It's the commercial element of it that Jack just does not bring anywhere near to the same extent. So that would be the only thing that they might have a view of 2026 and say, look, this could be beneficial, having this, having Franco in the car. Let Jack continue his simulator work. Let him continue developing the 26 car, and we'll kind of proceed from here. But yeah, they should put Jack back in the car. They've seen enough. It hasn't been an improvement, and he was the one with the original contract to drive for the team this year.
Only time will tell. And on that note, that brings an end to this week's episode of the Racing News 365 podcast. For those watching this podcast on YouTube, please do let us know your thoughts on the British Grand Prix and the first half of the season in the comment section below. Also, let us know who you think will be alongside Pierre Gasly in the Belgian Grand Prix. And of course, please do be sure to check out our special episode of the podcast next Monday. From myself, Ian, and Sam, we'll see you later. Bye, guys.
Thanks for watching. Take care as always, folks.
Thanks for joining us.